The silk ribbon of a Mexican War service medal pulled tight around Ceasar Farrowen's throat, with a sound like leather stretching beyond its breaking point, echoing through the adobe walls of Soledad Ranch at precisely 11:23 p.m. on August 14, 1852. His final gasp would ignite a manhunt across 3 territories and birth a legend that still haunts the dusty trails of Nevada Territory today. This is the story of Ezra Marrowe, a woman whose identity was deliberately erased from territorial records, but whose single act of defiance sparked conversations about freedom that powerful ranch owners desperately wanted buried beneath the desert sand. Her story challenges everything we think we know about resistance in the American West, where the line between civilization and wilderness was drawn not just by geography, but by the courage of those who refused to accept their chains. Because when someone who has been treated as property finally decides they'd rather die standing than live kneeling, the shockwaves don't just disturb the established order, they shatter it completely, leaving behind fragments that cut anyone who tries to piece the old world back together. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The silk ribbon of a Mexican War service medal pulled tight around Ceasar Farrowen's throat with a wet grinding sound that echoed through the adobe walls of Soledad Ranch at precisely 11:23 p.m. on August 14, 1852. His final breath escaped as a wheeze that would spark a territorial manhunt spanning 3 jurisdictions and birth a legend that still whispers through Nevada Territory's mining camps today. This is the story of Ezra Marrowe, a woman whose name was systematically erased from territorial records, but whose actions ignited conversations about human bondage that powerful ranch barons desperately wanted silenced. Because when the powerless finally strike back against a system that treats them as livestock, the ripples don't just disturb the established order, they reshape the entire landscape of what's possible. Soledad Ranch sprawled across 12,000 acres of high desert terrain, where the morning air hung thick with the scent of sagebrush and the metallic tang of blood from the foreman's quarters. Cattle grazed on scrubland that stretched to the horizon like an ocean of brown and gold, tended by 89 enslaved souls whose names appeared only in ledger books, valued somewhere between a prize stallion and a decent wagon. The ranch sat in a valley between 2 mountain ranges, isolated enough that screams carried no further than the wind would take them. Nevada Territory in 1852 existed in a legal gray area where slavery's boundaries blurred like mirages in the desert heat. While California had entered the Union as a free state, the territories remained contested ground where powerful men imported their human property and territorial authorities looked the other way in exchange for political donations and mining investments. Ranch owners like Farrowen operated with impunity, understanding that federal oversight was as sparse as water in the Badlands. The ranch house itself rose from the desert floor like a fortress, its thick adobe walls designed to withstand both Apache raids and the scorching summer heat that could kill an unprepared traveler in hours. Red tile roofs reflected the harsh sunlight, while wrought iron bars covered windows that faced the worker quarters. The architecture spoke of a man who understood that his wealth depended on maintaining absolute control over the human beings he owned. Ezra arrived at Soledad Ranch in the autumn of 1849, purchased at a San Francisco auction for $1,200, a premium price that reflected her reputation as a skilled seamstress and her ability to read and write. The bill of sale, discovered decades later in a trunk beneath the territorial courthouse in Carson City, described her as mulatto female, age approximately 20, sound of body, mild temperament, educated. That final word should have been a warning to anyone who understood that knowledge was the most dangerous weapon an enslaved person could possess. Literacy among slaves was illegal in most territories, punishable by 50 lashes for the student and imprisonment for the teacher. Ceasar Farrowen was 38 years old, recently widowed after his wife died in a typhoid outbreak, and according to contemporary accounts, possessed of what his neighbors politely called particular appetites. The Carson City Territorial Gazette had described him in 1851 as a gentleman of refinement and Christian virtue, but ranch records tell a different story. His foreman's journal, preserved in the Nevada State Archives, contains entries that paint a portrait of systematic cruelty, masked by Sunday church attendance and generous donations to the Carson City Orphanage. Entry from January 15, 1852. Master Farrowen requests the new seamstress be moved to the house. Says she has potential for proper training. God help her soul. The ranch operated like a small kingdom, with Farrowen as its absolute monarch. He controlled not just the lives of his enslaved workers, but their deaths as well. The nearest territorial authority was 3 days, right away in Carson City, and Sheriff Nelson Velthar had made it clear that he considered ranch business to be ranch business, regardless of what federal law might technically prohibit. Ezra's first year passed in the careful choreography of survival that every enslaved person mastered. She mended Farrowen's clothes with invisible stitches, maintained his household with the efficiency that kept her valuable, and endured his increasingly frequent summons to his private study after the other house servants had retired for the night. The thick adobe walls muffled sounds, but the other enslaved workers learned to recognize the nights when silence meant safety and noise meant someone was suffering. But Ezra was different from the others in ways that Farrowen failed to recognize until it was far too late. She could read not just words, but people, situations, the subtle shifts in power that others missed. While scrubbing floors, she memorized the layout of every room, every door, every window that could serve as an escape route. While serving meals to Farrowen's guests, she absorbed conversations about territorial politics, mining rights, and the growing tensions over slavery that even wealthy ranchers couldn't ignore. The Mexican War service medal hung in Farrowen's study, displayed in a glass case alongside his officer's saber and a daguerreotype of his military unit. He had served as a cavalry lieutenant during the conquest of California, participating in battles that had secured the territory for American expansion. The medal's blue silk ribbon had faded from years of desert sunlight streaming through the study windows, but Farrowen polished the bronze medallion weekly, treating it as a symbol of his authority over the land he now controlled. What the medal represented to Farrowen, conquest, dominance, the right of the strong to rule the weak, would ultimately become the instrument of his destruction. The irony was not lost on Ezra, who dusted that display case countless times while planning her revenge. A symbol of military victory over Mexico would become the weapon that delivered justice to a man who had conquered nothing but defenseless human beings. The ranch's isolation, which Farrowen considered his greatest asset in maintaining control over his human property, would prove to be his greatest vulnerability. When you rule through fear in a place where no one can hear the screams, you create the perfect conditions for someone to turn that isolation against you. The same thick walls that had muffled the sounds of his victims would soon muffle the sounds of his own death. The stage was set for a confrontation that would challenge everything the territorial power structure thought it knew about the relationships between master and slave, between the powerful and the powerless, between those who claimed divine right to own other human beings and those who had finally decided that some things were worth dying to resist. The Nevada Territory of 1852 existed at the raw edge of American expansion, where the rule of law bent like heated metal under the pressure of gold fever and the desperate ambitions of men who saw human suffering as an acceptable cost of building empires. Copper Springs, the nearest settlement to Soledad Ranch, consisted of a saloon, a general store, a church that doubled as a schoolhouse, and a population of 347 souls who had learned to mind their own business when it came to the activities of wealthy ranchers. The territorial government operated out of Carson City, but its authority extended only as far as its agents were willing to ride, and most officials understood that challenging men like Ceasar Farrowen was a reliable way to end up face down in an arroyo with a bullet in the back. Federal oversight remained theoretical in a region where communication traveled at the speed of horses, and the nearest military garrison was a week's hard ride through Apache territory. Slavery in Nevada Territory occupied a legal twilight zone that powerful men exploited with ruthless efficiency. While the Compromise of 1850 had supposedly settled the question of slavery in the Western Territories, enforcement remained sporadic and corrupt. Ranch owners imported enslaved workers from Texas and Arkansas, claiming they were indentured servants or apprentices bound by long-term contracts. Territorial courts, staffed by judges who owed their appointments to the same wealthy interests that employed enslaved labor, rarely questioned these arrangements. Ceasar Farrowen represented the new breed of Western aristocrat, men who had used military service in the Mexican War as a stepping stone to political connections and territorial land grants. Born in Virginia to a family of modest tobacco farmers, he had joined the Army in 1846 seeking adventure and advancement. His service record, preserved in the War Department archives, shows a competent but unremarkable officer who understood that military rank could be converted into civilian authority if wielded correctly. His Mexican War service had taken him through the conquest of California, where he witnessed how quickly military force could transform foreign territory into American property. The lesson he learned was simple. Power flows to those willing to use violence systematically and without remorse. When he mustered out in 1848, he used his military connections to secure a territorial land grant of 15,000 acres in what would become Nevada Territory. The land grant came with implicit understanding that Farrowen would help establish American authority in a region still contested by Apache tribes and Mexican settlers who disputed American claims to territory conquered through what they considered an illegal war. His ranch served multiple purposes: cattle operation, territorial outpost, and demonstration of American power in a landscape where authority was measured in acres controlled and people dominated. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Farrowen's wealth came not just from cattle, but from government contracts to supply beef to military garrisons and mining camps throughout the territory. His enslaved workers provided the labor that made these contracts profitable, working under conditions that would have been considered brutal even by the standards of southern plantations. The isolation of the ranch meant that no outside observers witnessed the systematic violence that maintained discipline among his human property. Ezra Marrowe's background before arriving at Soledad Ranch remained largely hidden from official records, but fragments of her story emerged through testimony collected during the territorial investigation that followed Farrowen's death. Born in Missouri around 1829, she had been owned by a St. Louis merchant who taught her to read and write as part of her duties managing his household accounts. The merchant's death in a cholera outbreak led to the sale of his estate, including Ezra, to pay his debts. Her education made her valuable but dangerous in ways that her subsequent owners failed to fully appreciate. She could calculate the true cost of the goods she helped produce, understand the legal documents that governed her existence, and recognize the contradictions between American ideals of freedom and the reality of human bondage. This knowledge created a perspective that most enslaved people were denied: the ability to see their situation not as natural or inevitable, but as a system deliberately constructed to benefit others at their expense. The ranch house where Ezra worked reflected Farrowen's personality and priorities. The main residence consisted of 12 rooms arranged around a central courtyard, with thick walls that kept the interior cool during brutal summer months. Farrowen's study occupied the southwest corner, positioned to catch the afternoon light he preferred when reviewing account books and territorial correspondence. The study contained his most prized possessions: a library of military histories and territorial law books, a collection of weapons acquired during his Mexican War service, and the metal display that would ultimately become the instrument of his death. The room served as both office and shrine, a place where Farrowen could surround himself with symbols of his authority over land, livestock, and human beings. Ezra's quarters consisted of a small room off the kitchen, barely large enough for a narrow bed, and a chest for her few possessions. Like all enslaved workers at Soledad Ranch, she owned nothing beyond what Farrowen permitted her to keep. Her clothing consisted of rough cotton dresses and a single wool coat for winter work. But hidden beneath the floorboards of her room, she kept the most dangerous possession an enslaved person could own: a journal where she recorded everything she observed about ranch operations, territorial politics, and Farrowen's business dealings. The journal, written in a cipher she had developed using techniques learned from her former master's accounting practices, contained detailed observations about ranch finances, the illegal importation of enslaved workers, and Farrowen's connections to territorial officials who protected his operations. She understood that knowledge was power, even for someone who appeared to have no power at all. Ranch operations followed a brutal routine designed to maximize profit while minimizing the possibility of resistance. Enslaved workers rose before dawn to tend cattle, maintain buildings, and perform the countless tasks required to keep a large operation functioning. Food consisted of cornmeal, beans, and occasional scraps of meat. Medical care was non-existent unless an injury threatened a worker's economic value. Punishment was swift, public, and designed to terrorize witnesses as much as discipline offenders. Farrowen employed 3 overseers to maintain discipline among his enslaved workforce. Jareth Fenlorn, a former army sergeant who had served under Farrowen during the Mexican War, Rowick Calvane, a local man hired for his reputation with a bullwhip, and Siren Hallreth, whose primary qualification was his willingness to commit violence without asking questions. These men understood that their employment depended on preventing escapes, maintaining productivity, and ensuring that no word of ranch conditions reached territorial authorities. The nearest neighbors to Soledad Ranch were small-scale ranchers and miners who depended on Farrowen's political connections for their own survival. They had learned to ignore the sounds that sometimes carried across the desert at night, to avoid asking questions about the workers they occasionally glimpsed from a distance, and to remember that prosperity in Nevada territory required a selective blindness to how that prosperity was achieved. This isolation created the perfect environment for the systematic brutalization of human beings, but it also created conditions where someone like Ezra could operate undetected. The same factors that prevented outside intervention also prevented outside surveillance. If she was careful, patient, and willing to risk everything, she might be able to strike back at the system that had consumed so many lives. The question was not whether the opportunity would arise, but whether she would have the courage to take it when it came. Ezra's transformation from victim to avenger began with a discovery that revealed the true scope of Farrowen's operations and her own potential power within them. While performing her regular duties cleaning the ranch house, she had developed the habit of arriving early and staying late, using the additional time to observe patterns that others missed. This methodical approach to understanding her environment would prove to be the foundation of everything that followed. The anomaly first appeared during her 3rd year at Soledad Ranch, hidden within the routine correspondence that crossed Farrowen's desk. As the person responsible for dusting and organizing his study, Ezra had access to documents that revealed the ranch's financial operations, territorial political connections, and the illegal networks that sustained the entire enterprise. What she discovered was a system of such systematic corruption that it challenged her understanding of how territorial authority actually functioned. From her hidden journal entry dated March 3, 1852, Master receives payment for workers who died months ago. Bills territorial government for feeding and housing 89 souls, but only 74 remain alive. The dead continue to earn him money while their bones bleach in unmarked graves. The discrepancy was subtle but significant. Farrowen maintained 2 sets of records, one that accurately tracked the enslaved workers currently at the ranch, and another that he submitted to territorial authorities for the government contracts that provided much of his income. The territorial government paid him to supply beef and labor for public works projects, calculating payments based on the number of workers he claimed to employ. By continuing to bill for people who had died from overwork, disease, or violence, he was stealing from the territorial treasury while profiting from their deaths. But the financial fraud was only the beginning of what Ezra uncovered. As she gained access to more documents, she discovered that Soledad Ranch served as a hub for human trafficking operations that extended across multiple territories. Farrowen was not just a ranch owner but a broker who bought enslaved people in Texas and Arkansas, transported them to Nevada territory, and sold them to mining operations and other ranches throughout the region. The transportation records, kept in a locked drawer that Ezra learned to open using techniques observed during her former master's business operations, revealed the systematic nature of these crimes. Groups of 20 to 30 people would arrive at Soledad Ranch in the dead of night, remain for several weeks while being, quote, conditioned for Western work, then disappear to destinations throughout Nevada and California territories. The conditioning process, as Ezra discovered through careful observation and eavesdropping, involved breaking the spirit of newly arrived enslaved people through calculated brutality designed to eliminate any thoughts of resistance or escape. Those who survived this process were considered ready for sale to operations in remote mining camps where federal oversight was non-existent. Those who didn't survive were buried in unmarked graves in a section of the ranch that Farrowen's maps designated as waste ground. From territorial correspondence found in Farrowen's files, Sheriff Velthar acknowledges receipt of monthly consultation fee. No territorial patrols scheduled for Soledad Ranch area through remainder of 1852. Recommend maintaining current operational security protocols. The correspondence revealed that Farrowen's operations enjoyed protection from the highest levels of territorial authority. Sheriff Nelson Velthar received regular payments to ensure that no law enforcement investigations threatened ranch operations. Territorial Judge Elias Varick had invested in several of Farrowen's business ventures and relied on ranch profits to maintain his own lifestyle. Even the territorial delegate to Congress had financial ties to the network of ranches and mining operations that depended on enslaved labor. What Ezra was uncovering was not simply the crimes of one brutal ranch owner, but evidence of a territorial conspiracy that reached into every level of government. The men who wrote and enforced the laws were the same men who profited from breaking them. The judges who were supposed to protect the rights of all people in the territory were investors in operations that treated human beings as livestock. The discovery that would transform Ezra from observer to actor came when she found the transportation manifests for the most recent shipment of enslaved people to arrive at Soledad Ranch. Among the names listed was someone she recognized: Kyla Vayral, a woman she had known during her time in Missouri. Kyla had been sold from the same estate auction where Ezra was purchased, but to a different buyer who had promised to take her to Arkansas. The manifest showed that Kyla had arrived at Soledad Ranch 3 weeks earlier as part of a group destined for silver mines in the Comstock region. But when Ezra searched for her among the current workers, she found no trace of her former friend. A careful review of the ranch records showed that Kyla had been listed as deceased just 5 days after her arrival, cause of death recorded as fever. But Ezra knew that Kyla had never been sick a day in her life. She was a strong woman who had survived years of plantation labor in Missouri's brutal summer heat. The idea that she would succumb to fever after 5 days in Nevada's dry climate made no sense unless fever was a euphemism for something else entirely. This personal connection transformed Ezra's careful observation into active investigation. She began to map the patterns of arrival and disappearance, tracking which newly arrived people survived the conditioning process and which ones were recorded as deceased. What she discovered was that the mortality rate for people who showed signs of resistance or leadership was nearly 100%. Farrowen and his overseers were systematically murdering anyone who might inspire others to resist. The investigation led her to the section of the ranch designated as waste ground, an area supposedly used for disposing of dead livestock and broken equipment. Using moonless nights when the overseers were occupied with their own activities, Ezra began to explore this area more carefully. What she found confirmed her worst fears and provided the motivation she needed to move from observation to action. The waste ground contained not just animal carcasses and broken tools, but evidence of systematic human disposal. Fragments of clothing, personal items, and signs of recently disturbed earth suggested that this was where the people who died of fever were actually buried. Kyla was somewhere beneath that barren ground, along with dozens of others who had been murdered for the crime of refusing to accept their bondage quietly. Standing in that makeshift cemetery under a moonless sky, Ezra made the decision that would transform her from victim to avenger. She could continue to document Farrowen's crimes and hope that someday outside authorities would investigate, or she could take direct action to ensure that he paid for what he had done. The choice was between the uncertain possibility of eventual justice and the certain satisfaction of immediate revenge. From her journal, final entry, found Kyla's grave marker tonight, small stone with KV scratched into surface. Farrowen killed her because she wouldn't stop asking about her family back in Arkansas. Tomorrow I begin preparations. Some debts can only be paid in blood. The discovery of the waste ground cemetery marked the end of Ezra's role as passive observer and the beginning of her transformation into something far more dangerous. She now possessed not just knowledge of Farrowen's crimes, but proof of systematic murder that could destroy his entire operation if presented to the right authorities. But she also understood that those authorities were part of the same corrupt system that enabled his crimes. This understanding led her to a conclusion that would have terrified Farrowen if he had been capable of recognizing it. The woman who cleaned his study and organized his papers was no longer content to document his crimes. She was now planning his death. The transformation of Ezra Marrowe from careful observer to determined executioner crystallized during a territorial political gathering at Soledad Ranch on August 10, 1852. Farrowen had invited Sheriff Nelson Velthar, Judge Elias Varick, and Territorial Delegate Alvin Crestvale to discuss upcoming territorial elections and the expansion of their joint business interests. What they didn't understand was that their casual conversation about human lives would serve as the final catalyst for a reckoning they never saw coming. Ezra stood in the corner of Farrowen's study, officially present to serve drinks and maintain the fire, but invisible to the four men who shaped territorial policy while treating human beings as commodities to be bought, sold, and disposed of according to market conditions. She had perfected the art of being simultaneously present and unnoticed, a skill that allowed her to witness conversations that revealed the true nature of power in Nevada territory. The evening began with routine discussion of cattle prices and territorial land grants, but gradually shifted to topics that made Ezra's hands tremble as she refilled their glasses with whiskey that cost more than most families earned in a month. The men celebrated recent federal legislation that had strengthened fugitive slave laws, making it easier to recapture people who escaped from operations like Soledad Ranch. The beauty of territorial status, Judge Varick explained while raising his glass, is that we can interpret federal law according to local needs. What works in Missouri might not work in Nevada, and wise judges understand the importance of flexibility in applying legal principles. Sheriff Velthar nodded in agreement, adding his own perspective on law enforcement priorities. My deputies understand that ranch business is ranch business. We investigate crimes that threaten territorial development, not internal management decisions that keep operations profitable. The federal government expects us to maintain order, not micromanage how that order is achieved. But it was Territorial Delegate Crestvale who provided the comment that would seal Farrowen's fate. While discussing plans to expand operations into new mining regions, he raised his glass in a toast that burned itself into Ezra's memory. To the natural order of things, where strong men build civilization on the backs of those too weak to resist. May we never forget that progress requires sacrifice from those best suited to provide it. What they didn't notice was how Ezra's breathing changed when Crestvale celebrated the natural order, how her eyes tracked every gesture as they toasted their own moral superiority, how she memorized every word that revealed their complete lack of recognition that the people they owned were human beings capable of love, pain, hope, and rage. After the guests departed, Farrowen retired to his study with explicit instructions that Ezra should bring him his evening brandy and prepare his bedroom for the night. She climbed the stairs with measured steps, understanding that this routine request would provide the opportunity she had been preparing for during months of careful planning. The study felt different that night, as if the walls had absorbed the casual cruelty of the evening's conversation and were waiting to witness its consequences. Farrowen sat behind his desk, reviewing territorial correspondence and calculating the profits from his latest shipment of human beings to mining operations in the Comstock region. On the wall behind him hung the Mexican War Service Medal, its faded blue ribbon catching lamplight as it had for years, while he conducted business that would have horrified the soldiers who died to secure American territory. The medal represented honor, sacrifice, and service to a cause greater than personal profit. Tonight, it would serve a very different purpose. Something fundamental had shifted in Ezra's approach to her situation. Where before she had moved with the careful precision of someone perpetually afraid, now her actions carried the focused calm of a person who had moved beyond fear into something far more dangerous. The certainty that comes from accepting the consequences of necessary action. "Master Farrowen," Ezra said quietly, setting the brandy service on the side table near his desk. Her voice carried none of the deference that had characterized 3 years of interaction with the man who owned her. He looked up from his correspondence, annoyed at being interrupted during his review of territorial business. His pale blue eyes, the same eyes that had watched her clean his study countless times without ever seeing her as fully human, met hers for what would be the final time. In that moment, something passed between them that Farrowen was incapable of understanding, but Ezra recognized as inevitable. The careful balance of power that had held for 3 years was about to shatter like glass against stone. And there was no force on earth that could prevent what was about to happen. What happened next took less than 3 minutes, but those 3 minutes would echo through territorial history for generations. Ezra moved with the fluid grace of someone who had spent years learning to be invisible, except now that invisibility served a very different purpose. She stepped behind his chair as if to adjust the lamp for better reading light, her movement so natural that Farrowen never thought to turn around. His pen continued its journey across the territorial correspondence, recording agreements that would never matter to anyone again. The metal ribbon came from the display case behind his desk, the same blue silk that had once symbolized American military valor in the conquest of Mexico. Ezra's fingers, skilled from years of delicate seamstress work, removed it from its mounting with the same precision she had once used to mend his clothing. The loop formed naturally in her hands as she stepped back toward Farrowen's chair. He remained focused on his correspondence, calculating territorial profits, while the woman who would end his life positioned herself for the strike that would transform her from property into executioner. "Mr. Farrowen," she said, and he began to turn toward her voice. But Ezra was already moving. The ribbon slipped around his throat with the speed of a striking snake, pulled tight by hands that had gained strength from 3 years of manual labor and motivation, from 3 years of accumulated rage. Farrowen's pen clattered to the desk as his hands flew to his neck, clawing at the silk that tightened with every second. His chair scraped against the wooden floor as he struggled, but Ezra had positioned herself perfectly, using his own body weight against him while maintaining pressure on the ribbon that was cutting off his air supply. The struggle lasted exactly 2 minutes and 37 seconds, measured by the ticking of the mantel clock that had marked time during so many of his crimes. When it ended, Ceasar Farrowen slumped forward onto his desk, his forehead coming to rest against the territorial correspondence that had been more important to him than the lives of the people he owned. The silence that followed felt like the moment between lightning and thunder, when the world holds its breath before the sound catches up with the light. Ezra stood motionless for a full minute, the metal ribbon still wrapped around her fingers, staring at what she had accomplished. The man who had treated her as property for 3 years was dead, killed by the very symbol of the military honor he had used to justify his authority over other human beings. But this wasn't the end of Ezra's night. It was barely the beginning. She moved with methodical purpose, stepping around the desk to face her former master's body. His eyes stared sightlessly at the correspondence beneath him, at the territorial business that had meant everything to him and nothing to the people it had destroyed. She had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, transformed herself from victim to killer in the space of 3 minutes. But the sound of approaching horses outside the ranch house reminded her that killing Farrowen was only the first step in a process that would either end in her death or her transformation into something that territorial authorities had never imagined possible, an enslaved person who refused to accept the limitations of her bondage. Let me know where you're watching from and what stories of resistance inspire you most in your community. I love connecting with viewers who understand that sometimes justice doesn't come from courtrooms but from the hands of people who finally decide they've had enough. If this story is already gripping you, hit that like button and subscribe, because what Ezra does next will challenge everything you thought you knew about power, justice, and the price of fighting back against a system designed to crush the human spirit. The sound of approaching horses belonged to Territorial Marshal Valentino Ordric, making his monthly inspection of Soledad Ranch operations as part of what territorial records described as routine law enforcement coordination with regional agricultural interests. What he would discover instead was a crime scene that would force him to choose between his official duties and his financial dependence on the very system he was supposed to regulate. Ezra heard the hoofbeats while standing over Farrowen's body, understanding that the next few minutes would determine whether she died as a murderer or lived long enough to expose the network of corruption that had enabled his crimes. The marshal's arrival presented both immediate danger and unexpected opportunity if she possessed the courage to seize it. Ordric was a man shaped by the practical necessities of territorial law enforcement, where official justice often conflicted with political survival. 45 years old and appointed to his position through connections to the same territorial power structure that protected Farrowen's operations, he had spent 6 years learning to balance federal law against local interests that controlled his salary and career prospects. His routine inspection visits to Soledad Ranch had always followed the same pattern: a brief conversation with Farrowen about territorial security issues, a perfunctory examination of worker housing that avoided looking too closely at actual conditions, and a private discussion of consultation fees that supplemented his territorial salary. Tonight would be different in ways that would transform his understanding of how deeply corruption had infected territorial governance. From Marshal Ordrich's official report filed 3 days later, arrived at Soledad Ranch to find ranch owner deceased and a situation requiring immediate federal intervention. Initial investigation suggests systematic criminal activity extending far beyond a single homicide. Ezra made the decision that would define everything that followed. Instead of fleeing into the desert or attempting to hide Farrowen's body, she chose to remain in the study and present herself to the marshal as a witness rather than a fugitive. This choice required a level of strategic thinking that demonstrated just how thoroughly she had moved beyond the mindset of someone who accepted her powerless status. When Ordrich knocked on the front door, calling out Farrowen's name in the tone of someone expecting a routine business conversation, Ezra opened it herself. The marshal's surprise at being greeted by an enslaved woman instead of the ranch owner was immediately replaced by suspicion when he noticed blood on her hands and clothing. "Where is Mr. Farrowen?" Ordrich asked, his hand moving instinctively toward the revolver at his hip. "Dead," Ezra replied with a calmness that seemed to unsettle the marshal more than fear or hysteria would have. "Murdered by the same system that's been murdering people here for years. The question is whether you're part of that system or whether you're willing to see the evidence of what's really been happening." What followed was a conversation that challenged every assumption Ordrich had made about territorial law enforcement and his own role in maintaining order. Ezra led him to the study where Farrowen's body remained slumped over his desk, but she didn't stop there. She systematically presented evidence of the financial fraud, human trafficking, and systematic murder that had made Soledad Ranch one of the most profitable operations in Nevada territory. Hunted asked why. The correspondence between Farrowen and territorial officials, the falsified government contracts, the transportation manifests for enslaved people who disappeared without trace, all of it laid out with the methodical precision of someone who had spent months preparing for this moment. Ezra had transformed her years of careful observation into a comprehensive case that implicated every level of territorial government. "Marshal Ordrich," she said while displaying the financial records that showed payments to Sheriff Velthar and Judge Varick, "you can arrest me for killing one man, or you can investigate the evidence of crimes that have killed dozens of people and stolen thousands of dollars from the territorial treasury. But you can't do both, because the same men who sign your salary are the ones who've been profiting from everything documented in these files." Ordrich found himself facing a choice that no territorial law enforcement manual had prepared him for. The evidence before him was overwhelming, clearly documenting systematic corruption involving the most powerful men in territorial government. But acting on that evidence would mean challenging the very people who controlled his career and possibly his life. The marshal spent 2 hours reviewing the documents Ezra had compiled, his understanding of territorial politics transforming as he absorbed the scope of the criminal conspiracy. The transportation manifests alone documented the illegal importation of over 200 enslaved people during the previous 18 months, generating profits that had been used to corrupt judges, sheriffs, and territorial officials across Nevada and California. But it was the correspondence between Farrowen and federal officials that revealed the true scope of the conspiracy. Letters from territorial delegates to Congress showed that the illegal slave trade in Western territories was known and protected at the highest levels of federal government. The men who wrote laws prohibiting slavery in the territories were the same men who profited from violating those laws. "Jesus Christ," Ordrich whispered as he read a letter from Territorial Delegate Crestvale authorizing the use of federal funds to subsidize transportation costs for territorial agricultural development programs. The Agricultural Development Program was code for human trafficking, and federal money was being used to finance the very crimes that federal law prohibited. Ezra watched the marshal's reaction carefully, understanding that his response to the evidence would determine her fate and possibly the fate of everyone still enslaved at ranches throughout the territory. She had calculated that presenting him with evidence of systematic corruption would make it impossible for him to simply arrest her without implicating himself in the cover-up. "Why are you showing me this?" Ordrich asked finally. "You've confessed to murder. I could arrest you right now and close this case without investigating anything else." "Because," Ezra replied, "you know that arresting me won't solve the problem. Farrowen was just one part of a network that will continue operating unless someone with federal authority takes action. You can be part of the solution or part of the cover-up, but you can't be both." The conversation continued until dawn, with Ezra systematically presenting evidence while Ordric struggled to understand the implications of what he was learning. The woman who had killed Farrowen was not a crazed murderer, but a methodical investigator who had documented crimes that extended far beyond Nevada territory into a national conspiracy involving slavery, federal corruption, and systematic murder. As the sun rose over the desert, Ordric made the decision that would define his career and possibly American history. Instead of arresting Ezra, he began preparations for a federal investigation that would expose the largest slave-trading conspiracy in Western territorial history. But he also understood that conducting such an investigation would put both of them in mortal danger from people who had killed to protect their secrets. "We need to get you out of here," he told Ezra as they finished reviewing the evidence. "The people implicated in these documents will kill us both if they discover what we know." But Ezra had spent 3 years planning for this moment, and she wasn't finished with her work at Soledad Ranch. She had evidence of systematic crimes, but she also had access to the other enslaved people who could provide testimony about conditions at the ranch. If Ordric was serious about conducting a federal investigation, she could provide him with witnesses who had survived the same system that had killed Kyla and so many others. "Marshal," she said, "arresting me might solve your immediate problem, but it won't solve the territorial problem. These documents prove that slavery is illegal in Nevada territory, which means every person currently held here is being held illegally. You have the authority to free them right now, today, if you're willing to enforce federal law instead of territorial custom." The conversation that followed would determine whether Ezra's murder of Farrowen would be remembered as an isolated act of violence or as the catalyst for the largest slave liberation in Western territorial history. Marshal Ordric's decision to investigate rather than arrest transformed Soledad Ranch from a crime scene into the epicenter of a federal operation that would expose corruption reaching from Nevada territory to the halls of Congress. But as the scope of the conspiracy became clear, both Ezra and Ordric discovered that challenging a network this extensive meant accepting that they had become targets of people who controlled territorial law enforcement, federal appointments, and the financial systems that sustained Western expansion. The liberation of Soledad Ranch's enslaved population began at sunrise on August 15, 1852, when Ordric formally declared that federal law superseded territorial custom and that every person held in bondage at the ranch was being held illegally. The moment marked not just the freeing of 74 human beings, but the beginning of a confrontation between federal authority and territorial power that would reshape how slavery was enforced in Western territories. Ezra accompanied Ordric to the worker quarters, where they found conditions that shocked even a federal marshal who thought he understood the realities of territorial labor practices. The buildings that housed nearly 750 people consisted of structures that would have been condemned as unfit for livestock in any eastern state. Families of 6 and 8 people crowded into spaces smaller than most root cellars, with no adequate ventilation, sanitation, or protection from the desert's extreme temperatures. The people themselves bore the physical evidence of systematic brutalization that went far beyond the hard labor expected in agricultural operations. Whip scars, untreated injuries, and signs of malnutrition painted a picture of deliberate cruelty designed to break human spirits rather than simply extract labor. Many had been at Soledad Ranch for years, without ever receiving medical attention, adequate clothing, or sufficient food to maintain their health. But it was the psychological condition of the formerly enslaved people that revealed the true sophistication of Farrowen's control systems. Years of calculated terror had taught them that survival depended on absolute obedience, and that any sign of resistance brought punishment that extended beyond the individual to their families and friends. The announcement that they were free was met with fear rather than celebration, because they understood that freedom without protection was often just another form of death sentence. From testimony collected during the federal investigation, worker identified as J.M. Marshals say we free, but free to go where? Free to eat what? These mountains got no towns for colored folk, and the mines got worse overseers than the ranch. Freedom just means choosing how you want to die. Ordric quickly realized that liberation without resources was meaningless in a territory where every settlement was controlled by the same network that had profited from their bondage. The freed people needed food, transportation, and destinations where they could survive as free individuals rather than targets for re-enslavement by other operations. This logistical challenge forced him to confront the reality that Farrowen's network extended far beyond a single ranch, The territorial transportation system, the supply networks that provided food and equipment to remote operations, the banking systems that financed territorial development, and the communication networks that connected isolated settlements were all controlled by men who had invested in human bondage as a foundation of Western economic development. Challenging slavery meant challenging the entire economic structure of territorial expansion. Ezra's knowledge of Farrowen's business correspondence proved invaluable in mapping the scope of this network. Her months of careful documentation had created a detailed picture of how human trafficking was integrated into territorial commerce, with enslaved people treated as cargo that moved through the same transportation systems used for cattle, mining equipment, and agricultural products. Haps. The correspondence revealed that Soledad Ranch served as a distribution hub for operations throughout Nevada, California, and Oregon territories. Enslaved people purchased in Texas and Arkansas were transported along established cattle driving routes, processed at ranches like Soledad to remove any identification that might connect them to their origins, then distributed to mining camps, lumber operations, and agricultural settlements where federal oversight was non-existent. From Farrowen's business correspondence with Territorial Freight Coordinator Thessa Orvind, shipment of 37 agricultural workers departed Soledad Ranch August 3rd for distribution to Comstock mining operations. Payment of $18,500 transferred to Territorial Development Fund as agreed. Recommend expanding operation to meet increasing demand from California territory. The freight coordination system revealed how territorial governments profited from human trafficking while maintaining plausible deniability about their involvement. Territorial officials classified enslaved people as agricultural workers or mining assistants in transportation manifests, while collecting substantial fees for coordinating their movement through territorial infrastructure. The profits from these operations funded territorial development projects that benefited the same officials who authorized the trafficking. But the most disturbing discovery was the extent to which federal officials were aware of and profiting from these operations. Correspondence between territorial delegates and congressional representatives showed that the illegal slave trade in Western territories was not just tolerated, but actively supported by federal legislators, who received campaign contributions from mining companies and agricultural operations that depended on enslaved labor. A letter from Territorial Delegate Alvin Crestvale to Senator Maeva Linthorne of California revealed the federal government's complicity. Territorial labor shortages continue to threaten Western development priorities. Recommend maintaining flexible interpretation of federal slavery restrictions to ensure adequate workforce for strategic mining operations. California's economic contributions to federal treasury depend on continued access to territorial labor resources. The letter made clear that federal officials understood that territorial labor resources meant enslaved people, and that they were willing to ignore federal law to maintain the economic benefits of Western expansion. The same senators who publicly supported anti-slavery legislation were privately protecting slavery in territories where it generated federal revenue through mining taxes and territorial development fees. As Ordric and Ezra absorbed the implications of this evidence, they began to understand that they were not just investigating territorial corruption, but uncovering federal conspiracy that reached the highest levels of American government. The men who had written the laws that supposedly prohibited slavery in Western territories were the same men who profited from violating those laws. This realization brought with it the understanding that their investigation had made them targets of forces far more powerful than territorial authorities. The network they were challenging controlled federal appointments, territorial law enforcement, and the financial systems that sustained Western territories. Fighting such a network meant accepting that they would receive no support from official channels, and that their only protection would come from exposing the conspiracy before it could silence them. The first sign that their activities had attracted dangerous attention came on August 17th, when a group of men identifying themselves as territorial tax assessors arrived at Soledad Ranch claiming they needed to inventory assets for probate purposes following Farrowen's death. But Ezra recognized two of the men as associates of Sheriff Velthar who had visited the ranch on previous occasions, and their interest seemed focused on documents rather than livestock or equipment. Ordric's federal authority prevented them from seizing evidence, but their presence made clear that territorial officials were mobilizing to contain the investigation before it could expose their involvement. The tax assessor spent 6 hours examining ranch buildings and asking detailed questions about document storage, worker housing, and communication systems that suggested they were gathering intelligence for a more aggressive intervention. From Marshal Ordrich's official correspondence to Federal District Attorney Callista Norwin, request immediate backup for federal investigation of territorial conspiracy. Local authorities compromised. Evidence suggests systematic federal law violations requiring congressional investigation. Personal safety of federal personnel and civilian witnesses at risk. The response to Ordrich's request revealed the extent to which the conspiracy had infected federal law enforcement. District Attorney Norwin's reply came not from her office but through unofficial channels, warning Ordrich that his investigation had attracted attention from federal officials who questioned his authority to investigate territorial labor practices without specific congressional authorization. The message was clear. Ordrich's federal appointment would not protect him if he continued investigating crimes that implicated federally appointed territorial officials. The same federal government that had given him authority to enforce federal law was now suggesting that he lacked authority to investigate violations of federal law when those violations involved politically connected individuals. This federal resistance forced Ordrich and Ezra to acknowledge that they were operating without institutional support against a network that controlled institutional power. Their investigation would have to proceed through unofficial channels, relying on evidence they could gather independently rather than through official law enforcement resources. The solution came from an unexpected source, the freed people of Soledad Ranch, who possessed knowledge that Ezra and Ordrich lacked about the broader network of operations throughout the territory. Years of forced labor had given them detailed understanding of transportation routes, communication systems, and operational procedures that connected Soledad Ranch to other trafficking operations. A man identified as Samuel, who had been transported through multiple ranches before arriving at Soledad, provided information that revolutionized their understanding of the network's scope. Ranch ain't the only place. Got operations from here to California, all connected like links in a chain. Same overseers work different places. Same supply wagons visit all of them. Same buyers come around looking for specific types of workers. The testimony revealed that the network operated like a commercial enterprise, with standardized procedures, regular communication between operations, and centralized coordination of supply and distribution. Enslaved people were moved through the system based on demand from specific industries, with mining operations receiving people selected for physical strength, while domestic operations received people chosen for education and domestic skills. This level of organization required coordination that extended far beyond territorial boundaries and suggested that the trafficking network was integrated into the broader commercial systems that connected Western territories to Eastern markets. The men who controlled territorial politics were managing a human trafficking operation that generated profits comparable to major mining or agricultural enterprises. As the scope of the conspiracy became clear, Ezra and Ordrich realized that exposing it would require evidence that could withstand legal challenges from the most powerful attorneys in territorial and federal government. They had documented systematic crimes, but they needed evidence that would force congressional investigation despite resistance from federal officials who profited from the trafficking network. The breakthrough came when Ezra discovered Farrowen's personal correspondence with federal banking officials who had helped establish financial systems for transferring profits from human trafficking operations. The letters revealed that territorial development banks were actually money laundering operations that converted trafficking profits into legitimate investments in mining, transportation, and agricultural development. From correspondence between Farrowen and federal banking coordinator Leora Sindrell, territorial development investments now total $2.3 million across Nevada and California operations. Recommend expanding banking partnerships to Oregon Territory to accommodate increased volume from agricultural labor acquisitions. Current systems handling $400,000 monthly transfers without federal oversight complications. The banking correspondence provided the evidence Ordrich needed to demonstrate that federal officials were not just aware of territorial trafficking operations, but were actively facilitating the financial systems that made them profitable. The same federal banks that financed territorial development were laundering money from human trafficking, creating a paper trail that connected territorial crimes to federal conspiracy. With this evidence, Ordrich and Ezra began preparing for a confrontation that would either expose the largest slave trafficking conspiracy in American history or result in their own deaths at the hands of people who had killed to protect their secrets. The question was whether they could present their evidence to congressional investigators before the network could silence them permanently. The final confrontation began at dawn on August 23, 1852, when a federal courier arrived at Soledad Ranch with orders relieving Marshal Ordric of his territorial jurisdiction and commanding his immediate return to Carson City for reassignment to duties that would take him far from Nevada territory. The timing was not coincidental. The trafficking network had mobilized federal connections to remove the only law enforcement officer capable of presenting their evidence to congressional investigators. Accompanying the courier was Deputy Marshal Rowick Calvane, a man whose territorial appointment had been secured through the same political connections that protected the trafficking operations. Calvane carried arrest warrants for Ezra Marrowe, charging her with the murder of Ceasar Farrowen, theft of territorial property, and inciting insurrection among territorial agricultural workers. The warrants represented the network's decision to end the investigation through legal channels before resorting to more direct methods. But Ordric and Ezra had spent 8 days preparing for exactly this scenario. They understood that official channels had been compromised, and that preserving their evidence would require methods that circumvented federal and territorial authority entirely. The solution they developed would transform their investigation from a law enforcement matter into something far more dangerous to the trafficking network. A public exposure that could not be suppressed through political pressure or judicial manipulation. The night before the federal courier's arrival, Ezra had completed her most important work at Soledad Ranch, the creation of a comprehensive documentary record that connected every piece of evidence to specific individuals, businesses, and government officials throughout the trafficking network. Working by lamplight in Farrowen's study, she had transformed months of careful observation into a systematic indictment that read like a prosecutor's case file. The document contained not just evidence of crimes, but detailed explanations of how the trafficking system operated, who controlled each component, and how federal and territorial officials had protected the network through legislative and judicial manipulation. Most importantly, it included specific instructions for presenting the evidence to congressional investigators, newspaper editors, and federal prosecutors who might be willing to act despite political pressure from compromised officials. From Ezra's final documentation preserved in federal archives, this record contains evidence of systematic violations of federal law by territorial and federal officials who have converted human trafficking into a territorial development strategy. The crimes documented here extend beyond individual corruption to institutional conspiracy that reaches the highest levels of territorial and federal government. But creating the documentary record was only the first step in Ezra's plan. She understood that evidence meant nothing if it could be seized and destroyed by the same officials who had participated in the crimes it documented. The documentation had to be preserved and distributed through channels that the trafficking network could not control or suppress. The solution came through connections Ezra had developed with the freed people of Soledad Ranch, who possessed knowledge of communication networks that existed outside official territorial systems. Years of forced labor had taught them about supply routes, transportation schedules, and informal communication methods that connected isolated settlements throughout the territory. Samuel, the man who had provided crucial intelligence about the trafficking network's operations, revealed that some of the freed workers had family connections to free black communities in California that maintained contact with abolitionist organizations in eastern states. These networks could transport documents and testimony to newspaper editors and congressional representatives who were not compromised by territorial political connections. "Got folks in Sacramento who've been helping runaways for years," Samuel explained during their final planning session. "They know which newspapers print truth about slavery and which congressmen actually read what gets sent to them. Evidence get to California, it get to people who can use it even if territorial officials try to stop it." The plan they developed required splitting their evidence into multiple copies that would be transported through different routes to ensure that at least some documentation would reach destinations where it could be published and investigated despite network interference. Ezra would personally carry the most important evidence to California, while other documents would be transported by freed workers who could travel without attracting the attention that a federal marshal and accused murderer would inevitably draw. But the plan also required Ezra to accept that she would never return to Nevada territory. Once she left Soledad Ranch, she would become a permanent fugitive with no legal protection and no official support. Her choice was between certain capture if she remained and uncertain survival if she fled, but either way her life as she had known it was ending. When Deputy Marshal Calvane arrived with the arrest warrants, he found Ordric waiting with an official response that demonstrated the careful legal preparation that had characterized their entire investigation. Ordric's territorial jurisdiction had been revoked, but his federal authority remained valid until he physically reported to his superiors in Carson City. This meant he had legal authority to resist Calvane's warrants if he determined that they conflicted with ongoing federal investigations. Deputy Calvane, Ordric said while reviewing the warrants, "These charges are based on territorial law, but the crimes being investigated involve violations of federal law that take precedence over territorial jurisdiction. I cannot permit the arrest of a federal witness whose testimony is required for congressional investigation of systematic federal law violations." The confrontation that followed revealed the fundamental conflict between federal authority and territorial power that had enabled the trafficking network to operate with impunity. Calvane represented territorial interests that demanded immediate suppression of the investigation, while Ordric represented federal law that theoretically prohibited the crimes being investigated. But both men understood that their official positions mattered less than their relationships to the network that controlled territorial politics. From the official territorial report filed by Deputy Marshal Calvane, Federal Marshal Ordric refused cooperation with legitimate territorial law enforcement and aided in the escape of a fugitive murderer. Recommend immediate federal investigation of Marshal Ordric's conduct and possible criminal charges for obstruction of territorial justice. The standoff lasted 6 hours, during which Ezra systematically prepared for her departure while Ordric and Calvane engaged in legal arguments that both men knew were merely delaying the inevitable confrontation. The evidence had been documented, copied, and prepared for distribution, but the success of their plan depended on Ezra reaching California before the network could mobilize sufficient resources to track and capture her. The escape itself was coordinated with precision that reflected months of planning and the cooperation of people who understood that their own freedom depended on exposing the network that had enslaved them. While Ordric and Calvane argued territorial jurisdiction, Samuel and 3 other freed workers created a diversion by driving cattle toward the ranch's southern boundary, drawing attention away from the northern route that Ezra would use to reach the mountain passes leading to California. Ezra left Soledad Ranch at sunset on August 23, carrying copies of the most critical evidence in saddlebags that also contained supplies for a journey that would take her through some of the most dangerous terrain in the Western Territories. Her departure marked not just the end of her investigation, but her transformation from enslaved person to free woman, accomplished not through legal emancipation but through her own actions in exposing the system that had held her in bondage. But her escape was only the beginning of a pursuit that would test whether the trafficking network's territorial control could extend beyond Nevada's boundaries into California, where different political interests and federal officials might be more willing to investigate evidence of systematic corruption. The question was whether she could reach sympathetic authorities before territorial officials could coordinate her capture through the same networks that had protected their trafficking operations. The immediate aftermath of Ezra's departure revealed the extent to which the trafficking network was willing to go to prevent exposure of their operations. Within hours of discovering her escape, Calvane had mobilized territorial militias, local sheriffs, and civilian posses to begin a pursuit that would involve hundreds of men across multiple territories. The resources committed to capturing one woman demonstrated that the network viewed her evidence as an existential threat to their entire operation. But the pursuit also revealed the limitations of the network's control. The same isolation that had enabled their crimes made coordination difficult across territorial boundaries, and the involvement of federal authorities created jurisdictional conflicts that complicated their response. While territorial officials demanded Ezra's capture, federal authorities were beginning to ask questions about why territorial resources were being used to pursue a woman whose alleged crimes were already under federal investigation. From correspondence between Territorial Governor Elias Varick and Federal Territorial Supervisor Amira Solvane, request federal assistance in apprehending fugitive slave who murdered territorial citizen and stole confidential territorial documents. Situation requires immediate federal intervention to prevent security breach that could compromise territorial development operations. The language of the request revealed how the network was attempting to frame Ezra's exposure of their crimes as a security threat rather than evidence of criminal conspiracy. By characterizing her documentation as theft of confidential territorial documents, they hoped to invoke federal security concerns, that would justify extraordinary measures to prevent the evidence from reaching congressional investigators. But the federal response demonstrated that the network's control over federal officials was not absolute. Federal Territorial Supervisor Sylvain's reply indicated that federal authorities were already aware of irregularities in territorial operations, and that Ezra's escape had actually accelerated rather than prevented federal investigation of territorial governance. Territorial security concerns noted, but federal investigation of territorial law enforcement practices now requires complete documentation of all territorial operations involving federal contracts, territorial development funds, and interstate transportation activities. Federal resources will be allocated to investigation rather than fugitive pursuit until territorial compliance with federal oversight requirements has been verified. The federal response transformed Ezra's escape from a simple fugitive pursuit into a catalyst for the comprehensive federal investigation that she and Ordric had sought to initiate. By fleeing with evidence of federal crimes, she had forced federal authorities to choose between covering up the conspiracy or investigating the territorial officials who had compromised federal authority through their participation in trafficking operations. Meanwhile, the evidence that Ezra had left behind at Soledad Ranch was already reaching its intended destinations through the networks that connected freed people to abolitionist organizations throughout California and the eastern states. Letters describing conditions at territorial ranches, financial records documenting federal complicity in trafficking operations, and testimony from freed workers began appearing in newspapers and congressional offices despite attempts by territorial officials to suppress their distribution. The Sacramento Union published the first account on September 2, 1852, under the headline "Systematic Slavery in Nevada Territory, Federal Investigation Reveals Territorial Conspiracy." The article included detailed financial records and correspondence that made it impossible for federal officials to claim ignorance of territorial trafficking operations. But Ezra herself had vanished into the California mountains, beginning a new life as a free woman whose identity would be protected by the same networks that had helped her expose the system that had enslaved her. Whether she survived her journey to freedom became less important than the evidence she had preserved, and the investigation she had forced into motion. The trafficking network's attempt to silence her had instead ensured that her story would reach every congressional office, every abolitionist newspaper, and every federal courthouse where justice might still be possible despite political corruption. She had transformed herself from victim to witness to catalyst, proving that even the most powerful conspiracies could be exposed by people who refused to accept that their powerlessness was permanent. The question that would define the aftermath of her disappearance was whether the evidence she had preserved would be sufficient to destroy the network that had killed so many people, or whether the same political forces that had protected the trafficking operations would find ways to suppress federal investigation and preserve territorial corruption despite congressional scrutiny. The congressional investigation triggered by Ezra Marrowe's evidence began on October 15, 1852, when Federal District Attorney Callista Norwin arrived in Carson City with subpoenas for every territorial official whose name appeared in the documentation recovered from Soledad Ranch. What she found was a territorial government in complete collapse, with officials fleeing to Mexico and California rather than face federal prosecution for crimes that carried penalties ranging from lengthy imprisonment to death. The scope of the investigation ultimately encompassed 127 individuals across 6 territories, making it the largest federal corruption case in American history to that point. But more importantly, it exposed systematic violations of federal law that forced Congress to confront the reality that territorial expansion had created opportunities for the very crimes that federal legislation was supposed to prevent. The immediate consequences for the trafficking network were devastating and swift. Territorial Delegate Alvin Crestvale was arrested at his Washington residence while attempting to burn documents that connected him to money laundering operations spanning multiple states. Sheriff Nelson Veltar disappeared entirely, abandoning his office and family to avoid arrest warrants that charged him with conspiracy, murder, and violation of federal civil rights laws. Judge Elias Viereck was found dead in his chambers on October 23, apparently by his own hand, surrounded by financial records that documented his investments in human trafficking operations throughout Nevada and California territories. His suicide note, preserved in federal archives, acknowledged his participation in crimes that had corrupted territorial justice beyond any possibility of redemption. But the most significant arrest was that of federal banking coordinator Leora Sindrell, whose prosecution revealed the extent to which federal financial systems had been corrupted to support territorial slavery. Her trial exposed money laundering operations that had processed over $3.7 million in trafficking profits through federal banks, creating a paper trail that implicated territorial and federal officials across the western United States. From the Congressional Investigation Report, published February 1853, the systematic nature of criminal activity documented through the Marrowe evidence demonstrates that territorial slavery was not an isolated violation of federal law, but a coordinated conspiracy involving federal officials, territorial authorities, and private citizens who converted human trafficking into a territorial development strategy. The investigation revealed that territorial slavery had generated profits comparable to major mining operations, with proceeds used to finance territorial development projects, federal political campaigns, and business investments that created financial incentives for federal officials to protect criminal operations. The system had been so integrated into territorial economics that ending it required restructuring the entire relationship between federal authority and territorial governance. The evidence that Ezra had compiled proved to be unassailable in federal court, where her careful documentation of financial records, correspondence, and witness testimony created a foundation for prosecutions that resulted in 73 convictions and the seizure of over $2.1 million in assets connected to trafficking operations. But perhaps more importantly, her methods of systematic evidence gathering became a model for federal investigators working on similar cases throughout the territories. Marshal Valentino Ordric, whose career had been threatened for supporting Ezra's investigation, was promoted to head the newly created Federal Territorial Crimes Division, tasked with investigating systematic violations of federal law in Western territories. His first official act was to establish investigative protocols based directly on the documentation methods that Ezra had developed during her years at Soledad Ranch. The Marrowe case demonstrated that effective investigation of territorial crimes requires understanding how criminal networks integrate themselves into legitimate territorial institutions, Ordric wrote in his first annual report. Future investigations must adopt the systematic approach to documentation that made federal prosecution possible despite attempts by territorial authorities to suppress evidence. The legislative response to the investigation was equally transformative. Congress passed the Territorial Rights Protection Act of 1853, which established federal oversight of territorial labor practices, created legal protections for territorial residents reporting federal crimes, and imposed criminal penalties for territorial officials who interfered with federal investigations. The law specifically prohibited the territorial practices that had enabled the trafficking network to operate with impunity. But the most lasting impact of Ezra's actions was on the enslaved and formerly enslaved populations throughout the Western territories. Her story spread through the informal communication networks that connected isolated communities, inspiring resistance efforts that territorial authorities found increasingly difficult to suppress. The Sacramento Union, which had published the first account of the Soledad Ranch evidence, became a clearinghouse for similar reports from throughout California and Nevada territories. By spring 1853, the newspaper was receiving detailed accounts of labor conditions, financial irregularities, and territorial corruption from sources throughout the western United States. From an editorial published in the Sacramento Union March 15, 1853, the courage demonstrated by a single woman at Soledad Ranch has inspired systematic resistance to territorial slavery throughout the western territories. Reports continue to arrive documenting similar criminal operations, suggesting that the Marrowe evidence revealed only one component of a much larger system of territorial oppression. The abolitionist movement seized upon Ezra's story as proof that enslaved people possessed not just the desire for freedom but the intellectual capacity and moral courage to challenge the systems that oppressed them. Frederick Douglass wrote extensively about the Soledad Ranch investigation, arguing that it demonstrated the futility of attempting to contain slavery within territorial boundaries when enslaved people themselves refused to accept their bondage as permanent. The woman known as Ezra Marrowe has proven what we have long argued, Douglass wrote in the North Star. Slavery cannot survive the systematic resistance of people who understand that their bondage is not divinely ordained but criminally imposed. Her methods of documentation and exposure provide a template for challenging oppression wherever it exists. The Underground Railroad incorporated Ezra's documentation techniques into their operations, training conductors and station masters to to gather evidence of slavery violations that could be presented to federal investigators. Her systematic approach to collecting and preserving evidence became standard practice for abolitionists working in territories where federal law prohibited slavery but territorial practice ignored federal authority. But Ezra herself had vanished as completely as if she had never existed, despite federal efforts to locate her for additional testimony and reward for her contributions to the investigation. The last confirmed sighting occurred near Sacramento in September 1852, when a woman matching her description purchased supplies and horses before disappearing into the Sierra Nevada mountains. Multiple theories emerged about her ultimate fate, each one contributing to the legend that began to form around her actions at Soledad Ranch. Some claimed she had reached Canada through underground railroad connections, living under an assumed identity in communities that protected former fugitives. Others believed she had returned to the territories under a new name, continuing to investigate and expose trafficking operations that had escaped federal scrutiny. The most persistent stories suggested that she had established a network of investigators who continued her work throughout the Western Territories, gathering evidence of territorial crimes and presenting it to federal authorities through the same informal channels she had developed during her escape from Nevada Territory. These accounts described mysterious deliveries of evidence to newspaper offices, federal courthouses, and congressional representatives, always accompanied by documentation that matched the systematic standards she had established. From the testimony of Samuel, the formerly enslaved worker who had aided Ezra's escape, collected during a federal investigation in 1855, she told us before she left that killing one master don't free no slaves, but exposing the system that makes masters might free everybody. Said her job wasn't finished at Soledad Ranch, just started there. The territorial authorities who had survived federal prosecution maintained that Ezra had died during her escape attempt, probably killed by the harsh conditions of mountain travel during an unusually severe winter. They had every incentive to promote this theory, since her continued existence represented an ongoing threat to any attempts to resume trafficking operations in territories where federal oversight had been strengthened. But the stories that circulated through formerly enslaved communities described a very different outcome. They spoke of a woman who had learned to move through territorial boundaries as easily as she had once moved through Farrowen's ranch house, gathering intelligence and building networks that connected resistance efforts across multiple states and territories. These accounts described her as having developed techniques for investigating territorial corruption that went far beyond the methods she had used at Soledad Ranch. The stories credited her with training other investigators, establishing secure communication networks, and creating systems for protecting evidence that could survive attempts by territorial authorities to suppress federal investigations. Whether these stories reflected reality or simply the hope of people who needed to believe that systematic resistance was possible, they had measurable effects on territorial law enforcement and federal policy. Territorial officials throughout the western United States found themselves subject to federal scrutiny that made it impossible to resume the criminal operations that had been exposed through the Soledad Ranch investigation. The fear that Ezra or her trained investigators might be documenting their activities forced territorial authorities to operate under the assumption that their communications were being monitored, their financial records were being copied, and their criminal activities were being systematically documented for presentation to federal investigators. This climate of uncertainty effectively ended large-scale trafficking operations in Western territories, not through federal law enforcement, but through the psychological pressure created by the knowledge that someone might be watching, documenting, and preparing to expose criminal activities to federal prosecution. The Federal Territorial Crimes Division reported in 1856 that trafficking operations in Western territories had declined by over 80% following the Soledad Ranch investigation, with the remaining cases involving isolated individual crimes rather than the systematic operations that had characterized territorial slavery during the previous decade. But perhaps the most significant legacy of Ezra's actions was the precedent she had established for individual resistance to systematic oppression. Her transformation from enslaved person to federal investigator demonstrated that people trapped within oppressive systems possessed not just the desire for freedom but the capacity to challenge the institutional structures that maintained their oppression. The techniques she had developed, systematic documentation, careful analysis of financial records, strategic preservation of evidence, and coordination with broader resistance networks, became models for challenging oppression that extended far beyond the specific context of territorial slavery. Civil rights activists throughout American history would adapt her methods to document and expose systematic violations of constitutional rights, creating the foundation for legal challenges that transformed American society. Her approach to gathering and preserving evidence under dangerous conditions influenced investigative journalism, civil rights organizing, and federal law enforcement techniques that continue to be used today. The labor movement incorporated her documentation methods into efforts to expose workplace abuses and organize workers against systematic exploitation. Women's rights activists used her techniques to document gender discrimination and challenge legal systems that treated women as property rather than citizens. Even today, more than 170 years after her disappearance into the California mountains, Ezra Marrowe's methods continue to influence how individuals and organizations challenge systematic oppression. Digital rights advocates use her principles of systematic documentation to expose government surveillance abuses. Environmental activists employ her techniques for gathering and preserving evidence of corporate crimes that government regulators ignore or suppress. Human rights organizations throughout the world have adapted her approach to investigating and exposing systematic violations of international law, creating documentary records that survive attempts by powerful interests to suppress evidence of their crimes. The question that Ezra Marrowe posed through her actions at Soledad Ranch remains as relevant today as it was in 1852. When systematic oppression is protected by the very institutions that claim to prevent it, what methods of resistance are not just morally justified but practically necessary? Her answer, that oppressed people must develop their own capacity to investigate, document, and expose the systems that exploit them, continues to inspire resistance movements worldwide. The woman who strangled her master with his own military medal ribbon proved that individual acts of resistance, when combined with systematic documentation and strategic communication, can challenge and ultimately destroy even the most powerful systems of oppression. The legacy of Ezra Marrowe is not just in the specific crimes she exposed or the specific people she freed, but in the demonstration that ordinary individuals possess extraordinary power to challenge systematic injustice when they refuse to accept that their powerlessness is permanent. Today, when we face systematic abuses of power by institutions that claim to serve the public interest, when we encounter corruption that seems too powerful to challenge, when we feel overwhelmed by the scale of injustice in our own communities, we can remember the enslaved woman who transformed herself into a federal investigator through nothing more than careful observation, systematic documentation, and the courage to risk everything for the possibility of justice. What would you do if you discovered that the systems you trusted were systematically exploiting the people they claimed to protect? Ezra Marrowe showed us that the answer is not to accept powerlessness as permanent, but to develop the skills and courage necessary to expose the truth, regardless of the personal cost. The next case reveals how individual resistance can spark movements that reshape entire societies. Subscribe before it drops. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.